Jasmine.
Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, we are going to Hollyweird to look at a frightening story of obsession. A celebrity therapist.
I have spent my whole life scared. Frightened. Things that could happen.
It's too far away.
Might happen, might not happen.
Nice, still that. Some bodies over here. Oh yeah, true. Yeah, also true. Probably gonna hit it. Yeah. How much? Let me see how much spider we have. Yeah, we do need those also. That's what I'm doing. I'm watching something.
A celebrity therapist.
I'm listening to some Joe Rogan, Shane Gillis.
Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, we are going to Hollyweird to look at a frightening story of obsession. A celebrity therapist is very good at talking to people, getting them to open up, be honest, and helping them. However, some people, well, an ex couldn't be helped, or maybe shouldn't have been helped. And so, a obsession began, which only became more and more dangerous.
Yeah.
Eventually leading to, well, something you would not wish on anyone. Except, you know, maybe, like, the person who did it. She'd had enough, he hadn't, and no would not do. Let's give it a go. So this whole video takes us to Los Angeles, the city of angels. Whoever named it that had a wicked sense of humor. On January 16th, 2020, at the JW Marriott in downtown LA, well, there was a big old event happening, and
missing
that is
something,
where
I might have
we
extra.
begin this story.
I don't have any snouts.
It was the annual XBiz Awards, the Oscars for the adult film industry, featuring a whole heap of actors who I definitely am very unfamiliar with and haven't seen their work. All the stars you've seen, you know, inside and out, were there, along with some people who were adjacent to the adult film industry. One of those attendees was a woman named Amy Harwick, a therapist who worked in West Hollywood. She specialized in family and sex therapy and had recently been working with Pineapple Support, an organization that provides free and low-cost mental health support to adult film industry folk. Amy Harwick was 38 years old, you know, and very accomplished. You know, like a celebrity therapist. She had written a book, she had done all the public appearances, and things were great. And so it wasn't surprising she would be on the red carpet that January evening, surrounded by photographers, and it was all smiles, glitz, and glamour. However, there was a dark shadow there too. One of the photographers in that sea of cameras knew Amy, or thought he did, and when he saw her, he became red in the face. With anger, with tears, both. He walked up to Amy and said, "Hey, it's funny seeing you here," but like not in a friendly way at all. Amy and this guy, they had a few words. You know, Amy being, she was always described as a super empathetic, kind person. So she was trying to calm him down, only he was getting louder and louder, and scarier and scarier.
He's looking over the hill, over the danger zone.
And he was saying she had ruined his life. See, this encounter was completely random and unexpected.
I see some spiders.
It would spiral out.
I don't see any alliance.
He was saying she had ruined his life, but tragically, 1 month later, on Valentine's Day, he would ruin hers.
Yeah. I can pull it over here.
Okay, hold on. Okay, so you have access to here? Is there anybody else inside the house?
My roommate.
Just your roommate by yourself?
Yes. Dude, I heard screaming. I don't know if that guy had a gun or a knife. I came running, I couldn't find my phone.
So is there somebody else inside?
Yes. So I think there's.
Okay, sir, do me a favor. Do me a favor. Calm down. Calm down. Other than your roommate, is there anybody else inside the house?
I don't know. I just heard her screaming.
Have you called?
I threw her to the ground. I've been calling for her through this window. Nobody's answering. Nothing.
Where?
Yeah, let's get an additional unit.
From what?
Yeah, I know, but
Not where?
Amy Harwick was born in 1981, the adoptive daughter of Tom and Penny Harwick, growing up just outside of Philadelphia. Amy was very close with her family, and even when she would leave and move to the West Coast, she would still fly home pretty often to see them. Amy was someone with a lot of drive, and so when she was 20 years old, she was like, I'm Audi 5000, she up sticks. She moved to LA to continue her studies in psychology. And from there, well, Amy was a master of reinvention. She was a master of networking, and she was just a really nice person, you know, people wanted to get to know. And the fact that she was real pretty didn't hurt. She started out as a personal trainer to the stars, releasing a DVD. Then she worked for Playboy, she modeled.
It took a really long time for me to figure out who I was as a person, and I think I'm still figuring it out, but it's been a long journey.
Yeah.
She bartended, she ate fire, she go-go danced, she did it all, and she had the confidence and the ability to put her money where her mouth was, and she worked hard to make friends, all the while studying at California State Polytechnic and later Pepperdine University. And it was in 2010 that Amy fell in love with a guy named Gareth Pursehouse. Gareth worked in IT, but he was also an aspiring comedian, photographer, a little bit of everything. Look at you. Born in 1960.
In the moonlight, my honey, I know with the dawn that you will be gone, but tonight you belong to.
This mother needs answers. Her daughter has been missing for 3 months. After she vanished, Layla's mom received Cash App requests from Layla's account. One of them said, "You'll find her in pieces." She received all of these requests for ransom of someone logged into Layla's account. I had the honor of meeting Jennifer to help get her story out of this small town of Tennessee. No media is talking about this case. Here is what happened the 24 hours before she went missing. Let's get into this. The last known sighting of Layla was at the Marble Slab Creamery, which is right here, and see this wooded area that...
Be warned, threshers gather by the stone claw and will attack those who trespass on their territory. Would you like a flight to Ruttheron Village, courtesy of the Cenarian Circle?
Oh.
Yours is gonna be 69. Here we go. Roll.
Oh. Man.
Alright, we both gotta roll on go. Alright, then it's gonna be 69. Alright? 3, 2, 1, go! Wait a minute.
Yeah, my bro, I got 11 and 12 back to back. That's fucked.
Wait, you got 11 and 12 back to back? And I
Yeah.
got 45, 46 back to back.
Well, yeah, that is trippy, actually.
What the hell? This shit's rigged.
Definitely rigged.
Yeah.
so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found, on March 25th, the Vallejo police held his girlfriend was missing and she had been kidnapped, but his story just didn't make any sense. When the officers got to this man's house, immediately they see this guy when he opens the door, and he looks deranged, and his house looks totally off and has this weird smell that's almost like a chemical smell. And then when they asked him, to give them some information, what's going on here? Where's your girlfriend? He would launch into this bizarre story about men wearing wetsuits with lasers on their hands. And so police are like, what is this? But the police would follow up and actually launch an investigation because this guy's girlfriend really was missing, and they would uncover a story that was even more bizarre and more weird than the 911 caller's story had been. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is out of town, go into their house and completely demolish their master bathroom and replace it with a used summertime music festival porta potty. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, and right now, at least according to Denise, they were off, and likely it was going to stay that way. But now, Aaron was texting Denise saying he really wanted to talk to her and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area, and Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiance had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship, and it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was
I'm back. I take my dog out.
a rebound, but again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that.
I sent him
So
back.
Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014, but 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiance, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so Denise felt really hurt. She understood that that was a really intense relationship, and of course Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree, but she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now here Aaron was blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like recording me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me, because right now there's no trust. And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise. But he said, you know, I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you. And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, no, I'm not going to come to your house. But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go, and he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise, and it made Denise feel special, and so eventually she kind of gave it up and said, you know what? Okay, I'll come by. And after that, Denise got up off the couch, she got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night, and then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's two-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat, she grabbed her overnight bag because she was optimistic that, you know, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle and maybe she'll stay the night. And so with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in, and Denise sent a text message to her boss saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, this doesn't make any sense. First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday, and he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so if she was missing the week, then it looked like
Would you say my headphone died?
For this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, you know, I understand you have an emergency, you know, we're here if you need us, you know, take whatever time you need. And then a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again, and he saw that she had not written him back. And so Denise's boss was like, wow, I guess, you know, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone. About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise had not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story.
You should check to see how much Chris Spider-Meat is in the auction house.
Police for help. Two police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived, and so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those two officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed...
My auctioneer says it's only 53.
The first
Copper.
was Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance
Or
that
auctioneator.
did not seem right. Two, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And
Yeah.
three,
You need
the
two,
entire
I
house
need
reeked
4.
of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, "Okay, well, we're going to take a look around." And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger, and they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking when...
Damn, you could farm condors, dude.
...on the bed, and he called the other officer over, and they walked over, and they looked down, and...
The tough condor meat for this quest sells for auctions for 16 silver.
And they went back downstairs where Aaron was, and they walked up to him and said, "Okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here." And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 in the morning that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend,
Spider-Meat?
when suddenly these men...
You have 3 of 5, I have 1 of 5,
And they
so
immediately
yeah.
tied up Aaron and Denise, and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them, and then they played this recording which had this weird soothing music and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders, and then at some point the headphones came off and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms, and they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords, and Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info, and then Aaron and Denise were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again, and then even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him so he couldn't leave to go save Denise. And so Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug. And then when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone. And so Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which again, you got to remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk. And so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying. And, you know, Aaron's just kind of loopy. And so the whole thing is just so weird. And so when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence, and then the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably this guy has killed his girlfriend, Denise, and after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals, and then maybe when he was done, you know, he felt bad about what he had done, and so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done, and that's why all those empty bottles were there, and that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then at some point he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff. But obviously it was just a ruse. This guy killed his girlfriend. That's what happened.
See you later.
And so finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." As much as I love whipping up old Long's favorite meal, a nice hot mug of musk. A nice hot frappe mug of muskox and blobfish stew. Sometimes I just don't have enough time. And when that happens, my quick option is a couple of mystery bird nuggets. However, as we learned last night, old Seagalong is allergic to emu. Emu was the mystery bird we sucked down last night. So unfortunately, mystery bird nuggets are out. However, I found an even better quick option, Factor. With Factor, you can skip all those grocery store trips and all the prepping and chopping and cleaning up that comes with preparing a full meal, but you still get the top-notch flavor and nutritional quality that you need. Factor's fresh, never-frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you gotta do is heat and enjoy. And Factor is flexible. I can adjust my order size to make sure I have enough to share with my family, and it's easy to skip a week or two anytime you know you're not gonna be around. For those of you who are confused, because I've previously stated my favorite meal kit is HelloFresh, well, don't worry, HelloFresh owns Factor, because HelloFresh wants to offer a wider array of meal options to satisfy all of their customers. So if you're in need of a quick meal option to replace your mystery bird nuggets, then look no further than Factor. My favorite Factor meal is the grilled chicken with browned butter Yukon mash. It's pretty good. Head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code MrBallin50 for 50% off your first Factor box. It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body, because based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like very likely she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station, and they began going over every single detail of the story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers, because as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And at the same time police were talking to Aaron, police also brought in Denise's roommate, and they asked the roommate, do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron? And the roommate would say, you know, those two have had a very troubled relationship. And the roommate would say that, you know, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station, and they would say, hey, you know, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you know, you guys were not dating. You had broken up. You know, explain yourself. And Aaron would say, well, actually, you know, that's why Denise was coming over before all this kidnapping. She was coming over so we could reconcile.
Oh, Gortias, the snouts, yeah, sorry.
When the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house. But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so really, it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords, and they did that. They gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account. 2 hours before Aaron called 911, he called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemicals smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them, but he said it was only for $8,500. So police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults, and Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point, that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on March 23rd, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird, and we have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case, they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. And after finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, March 24th, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station, and by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters, on telephone poles all over town, and TV news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed. A little bit after noon on March 24th, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news like it was completely no big deal.
Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the Alps.
And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address the kidnappers had used to message this reporter was an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what, this actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing, but it now really appeared that Aaron was involved.
I got food. I need you to eat though.
Denise sounded on this recording. She could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have, and he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers, and when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that like drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily, you have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever, and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from, and it was purchased from a nearby Target, and they looked at the security footage of around the time when this burner phone, was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man. Tall and fit,
I got an extra gorgeous now.
Nice. Looked exactly like Aaron. And then 2 days later, on March 25th, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep, and so Denise wound up going to the next door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story that she would tell her dad was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in this small room, and these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her, but when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found, on March 25th, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people who are successful, they come from good families, they have loads of future prospects, I mean, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own death. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they
shit, Horde,
was
on
that
me.
they were telling the truth. And so really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody until about 2.5 months later, on June 5th, 2015.
Oh, I'm dead.
That
Fuck.
morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin,
Yep.
which is just south of
Got ganked.
California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Gold case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone, not a burner phone that's totally anonymous.
Oh, my pet still got it
A cell
though.
phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner. And this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles northeast of Vallejo to the small remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI opened up the door to this cabin. Inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere, but none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers and high-powered flashlights and zip ties and goggles, like swim goggles, with tape all across the front of them blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair, it wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person, and this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice, and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there wasn't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Muller, the guy behind all this. And maybe just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California had found that cell phone, which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe, was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, June 5th, Matthew Muller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Muller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing, well, Muller was absolutely brilliant, like borderline genius, super smart guy, but he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar. And so basically he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow came across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them non-stop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky, and he thought, that looks like a drone, why is it out here? But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect.
I should have fucked. I need to clear I need to clear my inventory.
Was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so after Muller had surveilled
I need to send my other character some shit.
He was ready. And so in the middle of the night,
I got too much leather.
His house, wearing a wetsuit, he tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything, and then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music, and also had that narration where it was telling them, hey, you're gonna be fine, this is a robbery, just stay calm and do what you want. But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise. And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew, and then when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints, and he's still affected by the drug that was in the system, and he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, oh my god, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper, because again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500.
Inventory is full.
And so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat. But really, it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called in to Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew at some point had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers, but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Muller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about. We don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married, they would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F, From Crime Victims to Suspects to Survivors.
Just after 1:30 in the morning on May 12, 1994, a young girl ran out the front door of her home in rural Maine out into the rainy night. Barefoot and terrified, the girl went door to door screaming for help, but no one heard her. Finally, after running nearly 2 miles in the dead of night, she arrived in her little downtown and managed to flag down a restaurant owner. The owner would help the girl call 911, and within minutes, the police would arrive at that young girl's home. And what they would discover there was one of the most horrific crimes ever committed in that small town. Not only because of its sheer brutality, but also because of who committed it and why. We tried to make this story make sense, but sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. In late July of 1988, two hunters were walking up the steep mountain trail in Colorado looking for a place to set up for the day. And as they were walking, they eventually left the trail and began kind of meandering through the trees looking for a clearing. And at some point, they spotted a clearing up ahead, but in this clearing, there was this really bright white thing at the base of one of the trees. So the two hunters, they walked up to investigate what this white thing was, and when they saw it, they both knew immediately that this was something no one was supposed to see. And so after the hunters took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, they turned around and they rushed back down to town to tell authorities. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is at work, secretly sneak into their house and train their new puppy to bark at shadows and pee behind the washing machine. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 15, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhereness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read. A great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. That was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, and being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him a blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents. And the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe.
Where's my pet?
Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe that used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore And when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silverplume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silverplume
I got some yearling by me too.
Trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, I mean, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that, and so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things, but Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike, and he also had a deep fear of heights, and this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, you know, he was here in Silverplume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below, and so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything's okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, you know, it's totally fine, you know, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life.
Oh, dude, my inventory's too full.
And so, along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment, and he would make his way over to the bookstore, and he would sit down at his computer, and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, you know what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silverplume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of
you're loot on this condo over here.
And the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver, and suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silverplume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silverplume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silverplume, how, their town must be cursed. And maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument, and he thought of another strange Silverplume story, except this one hit much closer home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silverplume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods, up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silverplume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silverplume. And in Silverplume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silverplume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silverplume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night, when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point, Keith has been living in Silverplume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silverplume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these two hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the two of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these two hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these two hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the two skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family. And so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those two hunters had discovered Tom and Gus...
Alright, I'm probably gonna dip back and start to go to bed.
The wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located 7 feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service, because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment, and when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel, and he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing, and here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip, and it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, I hope you're joking. But Keith would say, I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now. And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing and told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so, the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside, and the door was locked and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car, and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened. And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after he had gone missing, and so by this point, he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom, looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over, and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday they'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above, and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, you know, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, you know, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's episode and you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we have hundreds of stories, many of which are exclusive to the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, walked into this strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was this circle of lit candles. And the trio, without saying anything, just marched into the circle of candles and took seats cross-legged on the ground, all looking inward toward each other. Then, after sitting there for a second, it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak, except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the 2 men who were sitting in the circle watching this woman, they were expecting this, and so they sat there listening intently for their instructions. And then after they got their instructions, the 2 men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual, and then the 2 men stood up, said their goodbyes, they turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving towards their target. But before we get into that very bizarre story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kotner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, and at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles. They sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont was the dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them, and as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. He knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was.